The January morning broke cold and gray over Marietta, Georgia, as Elwyn Bud Runyon carefully folded a crisp stack of $100 bills into his leather wallet. At 70 years old, his hands still moved with the precision of a man who'd spent decades working with machinery, measuring twice and cutting once. Beside him at the kitchen table, his wife June sipped her coffee and studied the Craigslist listing on her iPad for what must have been the 20th time that week. "It's exactly what you've been looking for," she said, her voice carrying that familiar blend of encouragement and caution that came from 50 years of marriage. A 1966 Mustang convertible, cherry red. The pictures look immaculate. Bud leaned over her shoulder, squinting at the screen. The car gleamed in the photographs like a jewel. Glossy paint, pristine chrome, white leather interior that looked barely touched by time. It was the same model he'd owned in his 20s, the car he'd driven on his first date with June, the vehicle that represented every good memory of his youth before mortgages and responsibilities had forced him to sell it. "Seems almost too good to be true," he murmured, though his eyes sparkled with unmistakable desire. "Price is right, though. Guy says he needs to sell it quick because he's moving out of state." June set down her mug and placed her hand over his. "We've been saving for something special. You've always talked about getting another classic car. If it checks out, why not?" The seller had identified himself as J. Towns in the emails, and his messages had been polite, almost eager. He'd explained that the Mustang had belonged to his late father and that he needed to liquidate the estate quickly. The asking price of $30,000 was fair, maybe even slightly below market value for a car in such pristine condition. He'd provided an address in McRae, Georgia, a small town about 3 hours south of Marietta in Telfair County. Bud had already researched the area. McRae was rural, population barely 3,000, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and left their doors unlocked. It was farm country, with vast stretches of pines and pecan groves, intersected by 2-lane highways that seemed to lead nowhere in particular. The remoteness actually reassured him. In small towns like that, people still did business on handshakes. The seller had even suggested they meet at his property rather than some public parking lot, which struck Bud as a sign of good faith. "I already told him we'd come today," Bud said, standing up and stretching his back. "Should get there around noon if we leave within the hour." June nodded, though something flickered across her face, a shadow of concern that she quickly dismissed. "Let me call Jessica and let her know where we're going, just so someone knows." Their daughter Jessica had inherited June's practical nature. When June reached her that morning, Jessica's immediate response was worry. "Mom, you're driving 3 hours to meet a stranger from the internet? About a car? Can't he bring it to you? Or meet somewhere more public?" "Your father's been looking for months," June replied, keeping her voice light. "This is the perfect car. We'll be fine, honey. It's the middle of the day and we're meeting at his home. Besides, your father's carrying cash, so we need to go to him." Jessica wanted to argue more, but she knew her parents. They were from a generation that believed in face-to-face dealings, in trusting people until given a reason not to. "Just text me when you get there, okay? And when you're heading back?" "Of course, sweetheart. We'll probably be home for dinner. I'll make that pot roast you like." June ended the call and found Bud already loading a duffel bag into their white GMC Envoy. He'd brought tools, a flashlight, a jack, basic diagnostic equipment, everything he'd need to properly inspect a vintage vehicle. He wore his favorite flannel shirt and jeans, looking more animated than June had seen him in months. Retirement had been good to them, but Bud needed projects, needed something to tinker with in the garage. This Mustang would give him that purpose. They pulled out of their driveway at 8:47 a.m. The subdivision where they'd lived for 30 years looked peaceful in the winter morning light. Neat lawns, American flags hanging limp in the still air, neighbors' houses with smoke curling from chimneys. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone attended the same church, where block parties happened every 4th of July, where nothing truly bad ever seemed to happen. The drive south began uneventfully. They took Interstate 75, the radio playing classic rock, Bud's favorite, while June dozed intermittently in the passenger seat. As they passed through Macon, the landscape began to change. The suburbs gave way to farmland. the four-lane highway narrowing to two. Pine forests pressed close to the road, thick and dark, broken occasionally by fallow fields or weathered farmhouses set far back from the pavement. Bud took the exit for McRae just after 11:30. The town itself was a handful of blocks clustered around a single main street, a Dollar General, a Hardee's, a few churches with white steeples, and buildings that looked like they hadn't changed since the 1950s. The address J. Towns had provided wasn't in town proper, but several miles outside, down County Road 447. GPS says it's about 15 minutes from here, June said, checking her phone. She noticed her signal was weak, just 2 bars, but still functional. She sent Jessica a quick text. "We're almost there. Everything looks fine. Dad's excited." The county road was narrow and winding, canopied by massive oaks draped in Spanish moss. They passed a few mobile homes, a rusted-out tractor in a field, a boarded-up gas station with vines growing through the broken windows. The deeper they drove into the countryside, the more isolated everything became. Minutes would pass without seeing another vehicle or any sign of human habitation. "Should be just up here," Bud said, consulting the directions he'd printed out that morning. He said look for a dirt driveway with a cattle gate. They found it exactly where described, a red cattle gate standing open, leading into a property dense with pines and undergrowth. A hand-painted sign nailed to a tree read, "Private Property." There was no mailbox, no house visible from the road, nothing to indicate anyone actually lived there. June felt that flicker of unease again, stronger this time. "Bud, are you sure this is right?" "This is the address he gave me." Bud pulled into the driveway, gravel crunching under their tires. "Maybe the house is set back from the road. Lots of folks out here like their privacy." They drove slowly down the unpaved drive, branches scraping against the sides of the Envoy. The path curved through the woods for what felt like half a mile, getting narrower and more overgrown. There was no Mustang, no house, no sign of J. Towns or any other human being. Bud stopped the vehicle in a small clearing where the driveway seemed to end. Before them was nothing but forest, thick, impenetrable, silent except for the occasional call of a crow. No buildings, no cars, nothing. "This doesn't feel right," June said quietly. Her phone was in her hand now, and she noticed her signal had dropped to a single bar. No texts from Jessica. She tried to refresh, but nothing loaded. Bud put the Envoy in park but left it running. "Maybe I wrote down the wrong address. Let me check the emails again." He pulled out his phone, but like June's, the signal was nearly non-existent. The screen showed he had no data connection. He tried pulling up the Craigslist correspondence, but the page wouldn't load. That's when they heard it. The sound of another vehicle approaching from behind them, from the direction they'd come. Through the rearview mirror, Bud saw a dark pickup truck rolling slowly down the narrow driveway, blocking their only exit. The truck stopped about 30 feet behind them, its engine idling. A figure sat behind the wheel, but with the sun glare on the windshield, Bud couldn't make out any features. The driver didn't get out, didn't wave, just sat there watching them. June's grip tightened on her phone. "Bud, we need to leave. Now." Before Bud could respond, the truck's door opened. A man stepped out, tall, maybe mid-30s, wearing a camouflage jacket and work boots. His face was expressionless as he walked slowly toward their vehicle, one hand hidden in his jacket pocket. Bud's instinct was still to be polite, to assume this was J. Towns, that there'd been some confusion about the meeting spot. He rolled down his window halfway. "Afternoon, we're looking for J. Towns. We're here about the Mustang." The man stopped a few feet from the driver's door. Up close, Bud could see his eyes, cold, calculating, completely devoid of the friendly salesmanship he'd expected. When the man spoke, his voice was flat and emotionless. "There is no Mustang." In that moment, Bud Runyon understood with perfect, terrible clarity that he and June had driven 3 hours into isolation to meet someone who never intended to sell them anything at all. They had brought $30,000 in cash to a place with no witnesses, no cell service, no way to call for help. June saw it in her husband's face. The recognition of danger, the shift from confusion to fear. She fumbled with her phone, desperately trying to get a signal, to send any kind of message to their daughter, to anyone who might know where they were. But in that clearing, miles from civilization, surrounded by forests thick enough to swallow screams, their phones showed nothing but empty signal bars and rotating loading icons that would never connect. They were completely, utterly alone with a stranger who had carefully, methodically lured them here. The trap had closed. Jessica Runyon checked her phone for the 7th time in 10 minutes. It was 4:30 in the afternoon, and she hadn't heard from her parents since that brief text at 11:45, saying they'd arrived at the seller's location. She'd expected updates. Her mother was usually meticulous about keeping her informed, especially when traveling. The silence felt wrong. She tried calling her mother's cell phone again. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. "Mom, it's me again. Just getting worried. Call me back when you get this, okay?" She kept her voice light, but her stomach was knotting with anxiety. Her husband, Mark, looked up from his laptop at the kitchen table. Still nothing? Nothing. And they should have been home by now. Even if they bought the car and Dad wanted to drive it back separately, they would have called. Jessica pulled up the text thread with her mother, staring at that last message as if it might reveal something new. "I should have pushed harder this morning. I should have insisted they not go." Mark closed his laptop and came over to her. "They're adults, Jess. Probably just got caught up looking at the car, lost track of time. You know how your dad gets about classic vehicles." But Jessica couldn't shake the feeling. She opened her laptop and pulled up the original Craigslist ad her father had shown her days earlier. The listing was still there. A 1966 Mustang convertible, cherry red, with 4 photos showing different angles of the pristine vehicle. The seller's name was listed as J. Towns, with a phone number and an email address. The location just said McRae, GA. She dialed the number from the listing. It rang once, then disconnected with a rapid, busy signal. She tried again. Same result. The number was no longer in service. "Mark, something's wrong." Her voice was tight now. "The seller's number is disconnected." Mark's expression shifted from dismissive to concerned. "When did they say they were meeting him?" "Around noon, in McRae. But I don't have an exact address." Jessica frantically searched through her recent calls, trying to remember if her mother had mentioned a street name or any specific landmark. Nothing. She'd been so focused on expressing her worry that she hadn't asked for details. By 5 o'clock, with the winter sun already setting and still no word from her parents, Jessica called the Telfair County Sheriff's Office. The dispatcher who answered sounded young, maybe early 20s, with a slow drawl that made every word feel like it took twice as long as necessary. "Telfair County Sheriff's Office, this is Deputy Wallace. How can I help you? My parents are missing. They drove down to McRae this morning to buy a car from someone on Craigslist, and I haven't heard from them in over 5 hours. Their phones are going straight to voicemail." There was a pause on the line. "When you say missing, ma'am, how long exactly has it been since you've heard from them?" "Since 11:45 this morning. They texted me when they arrived at the location, but nothing since. That was almost 6 hours ago." Another pause. Jessica could hear papers rustling in the background. "Well, ma'am, technically an adult isn't considered missing until 24 hours have passed. They might have just lost cell service or their phones died. Happens a lot out here in the county. Coverage can be spotty." Jessica felt her frustration rising. They're 70 years old. They were meeting a stranger to buy a car. The seller's phone number is now disconnected. Something is wrong. "I understand your concern, ma'am, I do. But we can't really start a formal search until—" "Can you at least check the area? Drive by the address where they were supposed to meet?" Jessica heard the desperation creeping into her voice. "Please. I just need to know they're okay." The deputy sighed. "If you can give me the exact address, I can have a patrol car swing by when one becomes available. We're a small department, ma'am, and we're currently dealing with a domestic situation and a traffic accident on Highway 319. Jessica's hands were shaking. "I don't have the exact address, just that it was somewhere in or near McRae. They were meeting someone named J. Towns about a 1966 Mustang." Without an address, ma'am, there's not much I can do tonight. McRae and the surrounding county covers a lot of ground, mostly farmland and forest. If you can get me more specific information, call back. Otherwise, I'd suggest waiting until morning. I'm sure they're fine and just ran into some car trouble or lost their phones. Jessica wanted to scream. Instead, she forced herself to stay calm. If I don't hear from them by morning, I'm filing a formal missing persons report. That's your right, ma'am. In the meantime, try not to worry. 99 times out of 100, these situations resolve themselves. The call ended, leaving Jessica staring at her phone in disbelief. Mark had heard the entire conversation from across the room. They're not going to do anything? Not until tomorrow. Not without an address. Jessica felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she pushed them back. Crying wouldn't help her parents. We need to find that address ourselves. They spent the next 2 hours searching. Jessica logged into her father's email account. She'd set it up for him years ago and knew the password, and found the entire correspondence with J. Towns. The email thread showed a week's worth of messages, with Towns providing increasingly specific information about the Mustang, its condition, its history. In the final email, sent just 2 days before, he'd written, "Let's meet at my place. Easier to look at the car properly. Address is 4574 County Road 447, McRae. There's a red cattle gate at the entrance. Can't miss it." Jessica immediately called the sheriff's office back. This time, a different dispatcher answered, an older woman who sounded more engaged. Jessica explained everything again, providing the specific address. 4574 County Road 447, the woman repeated. "Hold on, hon, let me pull that up in our system." There was a long pause, the sound of typing. That's interesting. According to our property records, that address doesn't exist. County Road 447 ends at number 4200. There's nothing out that far, just state forest land. Jessica's blood went cold. What does that mean? It means whoever gave your parents that address sent them to an empty location. There's no house out there, no property, just woods. The dispatcher's tone had changed, becoming more serious. "I'm going to transfer you to Detective Wardell. He needs to hear this." Detective Paul Wardell had been with the Telfair County Sheriff's Office for 15 years. At 43, he'd seen his share of strange cases in this rural corner of Georgia. But something about Jessica Runion's call made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. An elderly couple lured to a fake address with promises of a classic car, a disconnected phone number, a seller who'd spent days building trust through careful, detailed emails. This wasn't incompetence or confusion. This was deliberate. "Mrs. Runion," he said when Jessica's call was transferred to his desk, "I need you to forward me every email your father exchanged with this J. Towns, and I need the make, model, and license plate of your parents' vehicle." Jessica rattled off the information through tears she could no longer hold back. "It's a white GMC Envoy, Georgia plates. Please, detective, you have to find them." "We're going to do everything we can," Wardell promised, but his mind was already racing through darker possibilities. "I'm sending deputies out to County Road 447 right now. If your parents' vehicle is out there, we'll find it." He hung up and immediately radioed for all available units. Within 20 minutes, 3 patrol cars were heading toward the location, their headlights cutting through the darkness of the rural roads. Wardell drove out himself, bringing floodlights and his evidence collection kit. He didn't want to consider why he might need it, but 30 years of law enforcement had taught him to prepare for the worst. The red cattle gate was exactly where the fake address indicated, standing open, leading into darkness. The deputies parked their vehicles in a line, headlights illuminating the narrow dirt driveway. Wardell stepped out into the cold night air, his breath misting. The forest was utterly silent. No wind, no animals, nothing but the idle of their engines and the crackle of radios. "Spread out," he ordered. "Look for tire tracks, any sign of vehicles, anything disturbed." They walked the driveway slowly, methodically, their flashlight beams sweeping back and forth across the muddy ground. Fresh tire tracks were immediately visible. 2 sets, both recent, pressed into the soft earth. One set appeared to belong to a larger vehicle, possibly an SUV. The other was from a truck, with wider tires and deeper treads. The driveway curved through the pines for roughly half a mile before opening into a small clearing. And there, abandoned and empty in the middle of the clearing, illuminated by their collective flashlights, was a white GMC Envoy. Wardell approached slowly, his hand instinctively moving to his service weapon. The vehicle's doors were closed. The windows were intact. But when he peered inside with his flashlight, his heart sank. The driver's seat was pushed back at an odd angle. A woman's purse sat on the passenger floorboard, its contents partially spilled. A wallet, reading glasses, tissues. On the center console was a cell phone with a cracked screen. In the back seat, a duffel bag lay open, tools scattered across the upholstery. But no Bud Runyon, no June Runyon, no sign of where they'd gone or what had happened to them. Wardell carefully opened the driver's door using a pen through the handle to avoid contaminating potential evidence. The keys were still in the ignition, turned to the off position. The interior smelled faintly of coffee and the vanilla air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror. Everything looked ordinary, domestic, innocent, except for the two empty seats where an elderly couple should have been. "Detective," one of the deputies called from the edge of the clearing, his voice strained. "You need to see this." Wardell walked over to where the deputy stood, shining his light on the ground. Drag marks. Two sets of parallel lines scored deep into the mud and dead leaves, leading from near where the envoy sat toward the deeper forest. And beside them, small but unmistakable in the beam of the flashlight, were scattered droplets of something dark that Wardell knew, with sick certainty, was blood. The case had just become a homicide investigation. Detective Paul Wardell stood in the clearing at 6:15 a.m. on January 23rd, watching the sun rise through the pines. He'd been awake for 24 hours straight, coordinating search teams, processing the crime scene, and trying to answer Jessica Runyon's increasingly frantic phone calls with information he didn't have. The K-9 units had arrived just after midnight, and now, as pale winter light filtered through the canopy, the German shepherds were pulling their handlers deeper into the woods, following a scent trail that led away from the abandoned Envoy. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees overnight. Wardell's breath came out in white clouds as he followed the search team down a steep embankment thick with underbrush. If Bud and June Runyon were out here somewhere, injured, lost, or worse, every hour mattered. But in his gut, Wardell already knew this wasn't a rescue operation. The blood evidence, the drag marks, the methodical nature of the crime scene all pointed toward one terrible conclusion. "Detective," one of the K-9 handlers shouted from about 50 yards ahead. "We've got something." Wardell pushed through the dense vegetation, brambles catching on his jacket. The handler stood at the edge of a steep ravine, his dog sitting alertly, trained to indicate the presence of human remains. Below them, barely visible through the morning mist and thick undergrowth, were two shapes that didn't belong in the natural landscape. It took 3 deputies with ropes and climbing equipment to safely descend into the ravine. Wardell went down with them, his boots slipping on the muddy slope. The shapes resolved themselves as they got closer, 2 bodies partially concealed by fallen branches and dead leaves, as if someone had made a half-hearted attempt to hide them before fleeing. Bud Runyon lay on his back, his flannel shirt soaked with dried blood. His eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the canopy above. He'd been shot multiple times in the chest at close range. His wallet was missing from his back pocket, and the impression in the mud suggested someone had searched his body thoroughly. June Runyon was several feet away, face down in the leaf litter. She'd been shot in the back, execution style, as if she'd tried to run. Her hands were scratched and muddy, fingernails broken, evidence of a desperate struggle or attempt to crawl away. Her purse was gone, but her wedding ring was still on her finger, glinting dully in the gray morning light. Wardell knelt beside the bodies, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. This was murder, plain and simple. Premeditated, cold-blooded robbery that had ended with 2 elderly people executed in a forest and dumped like garbage. Someone had carefully crafted an elaborate scheme. The fake Craigslist ad, the email correspondence building trust, the isolated location with no witnesses. all designed to lure victims into a killing ground. "Coroner's on the way," one of the deputies said quietly. "ETA 30 minutes. Wardell stood and surveyed the scene. The bodies had been dragged approximately 200 yards from where the Envoy was parked, through difficult terrain that would have required significant physical strength. The killer, or killers, had then pushed them over the edge of this ravine, perhaps hoping they wouldn't be found for days or weeks. But the drag marks had been sloppy, the concealment rushed. Whoever did this had panicked after the murders, desperate to get away from the scene. By 9 a.m., the crime scene was swarming with investigators. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation had sent forensics teams from their regional office in Eastman. Evidence markers dotted the landscape: spent shell casings, footprints, tire tracks, blood spatter patterns. A portable generator powered floodlights that turned the forest into a surreal stage of death. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Chen, arrived and conducted her preliminary examination at the scene. Wardell stood beside her as she worked, watching her methodical documentation of each wound. "Multiple gunshot wounds for the male victim," Dr. Chen said, speaking into her digital recorder. "Preliminary count suggests 4 entry wounds to the chest and abdomen. Close range, probably within 10 feet based on powder burns. The female victim has 2 entry wounds to the back, also close range. Time of death. Given the temperature and the state of rigor mortis, I'd estimate between 12 and 18 hours ago. So sometime yesterday afternoon, probably between noon and 3 p.m., which meant the Runions had been murdered almost immediately after arriving at the location. There'd been no prolonged confrontation, no extended robbery scenario. Just a quick, brutal execution followed by an attempt to hide the bodies." Back at the sheriff's office, Wardell assembled every piece of evidence they had. The email correspondence with Jay Towns had been sent from a free Gmail account that the GBI's cybercrimes unit was attempting to trace. The phone number from the Craigslist ad was a burner phone, purchased with cash at a Walmart in Jacksonville 3 weeks earlier. The surveillance footage from that store showed a man in a baseball cap and sunglasses, deliberately obscuring his face, buying the phone along with prepaid minutes. But they had something the killer didn't know about: the Envoy's GPS navigation system. Modern vehicles kept logs of every destination entered, every route traveled. The forensics team extracted the data and found that the Runions' last entered destination was exactly where they'd told Jessica they were going: 4574 County Road 447. More importantly, the GPS had logged another vehicle's Bluetooth signature that had been in range of the Envoy for approximately 15 minutes before the system shut off. The killer's phone or vehicle had Bluetooth enabled, the tech specialist explained to Wardell. The Envoy's system automatically scanned for nearby devices and logged them. "We've got a partial device ID here. If we can find the phone or car this came from, we can place them at the scene at the exact time of the murders." It was the break Wardell needed, but they still didn't know who Jay Towns really was, or where he'd gone after dumping the bodies. Jessica Runion received the official notification at 10:30 a.m. Detective Wardell drove to Marietta himself to deliver the news in person rather than over the phone. He sat in the family's living room, the same living room where Bud and June had planned their trip just 36 hours earlier, and watched Jessica's face crumble as he explained what they'd found. "They were murdered," she whispered, the words seeming impossible even as she spoke them. "Someone killed them for what? A car that didn't even exist? For the cash your father was carrying?" Wardell said gently. $30,000. "We believe this was a robbery scheme specifically targeting people responding to high-value classified ads. Your parents were lured to an isolated location where there were no witnesses, no cell service, no way to call for help." Mark wrapped his arms around his wife as she began to sob. "Are you going to catch whoever did this?" "Yes," Wardell said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "We have evidence, we have leads, and we're not going to stop until we find the person responsible and put them in prison for the rest of their life." But even as he made that promise, Wardell knew how difficult the investigation would be. Rural Telfair County had limited resources, and the killer had clearly planned this crime carefully. They were dealing with someone intelligent, someone who understood how to use technology and isolation to their advantage. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. 2 days after the bodies were discovered, a woman named Sandra Tate walked into the Telfair County Sheriff's Office and asked to speak to whoever was investigating the Runyon murders. She was nervous, fidgeting with her purse strap, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid someone might see her. Wardell brought her into an interview room and offered her coffee, which she declined. "Ma'am, you said you have information about the Runyon case." Sandra nodded, her hands shaking. I think my nephew might be involved. Ronnie Towns. He's been acting strange the past few days. Real paranoid. Talking about leaving the state, spending money he doesn't have. Ronnie Towns, Wardell repeated, his pulse quickening. Any relation to J. Towns? That's not his real name. Ronnie's full name is Ronnie Adrian Towns. He sometimes uses J as a nickname. It's his middle name, Adrian, but some people call him AJ or J. He's 31, lives with his girlfriend out past McRae in a trailer. He's been in trouble before. Petty theft, drug possession. Wrote some bad checks a few years back. Wardell was already pulling up the criminal database. Ronnie Adrian Towns. White male, age 31, 6'2", approximately 190 pounds. Multiple arrests, 2 short jail stints, currently on probation for theft. His mugshot showed a thin face with hard eyes and a goatee. What makes you think he's involved in the Runyon murder specifically? Wardell asked. Sandra swallowed hard. Because 3 days ago, he came to my house trying to sell me a laptop and some fancy watch. Said he'd found them at a pawn shop, but they looked new, expensive. And the laptop, when he opened it to show me it worked, I saw the wallpaper. It was a picture of an older couple standing in front of a Christmas tree. She pulled out her phone and showed Wardell a photo she'd secretly taken. I saw the news about the missing couple, and when they showed the victims' pictures, I recognized them. That was the same couple from the laptop wallpaper. Wardell stared at the photo on Sandra's phone. It showed Ronnie Towns holding a silver laptop, and though the image was slightly blurry, he could make out the wallpaper on the screen. An elderly couple in front of a decorated Christmas tree, smiling at the camera. The man wore a flannel shirt. The woman had curly gray hair. It was Bud and June Runyon. "Where is your nephew now?" Wardell asked, already standing. "He's staying at his girlfriend's trailer, or he was yesterday. I don't know if he's still there." Sandra wrote down an address with trembling hands. "Please, he's my sister's boy, but if he did this, those poor people." Within an hour, Wardell had assembled a tactical team. They obtained a warrant for Ronnie Towns' arrest and for the search of his girlfriend's property. As the sun set on January 25th, 3 days after the Runyons had been murdered, 6 patrol cars and a SWAT van rolled silently down a dirt road toward a dilapidated trailer on the outskirts of Telfair County. The trailer's windows glowed with yellow light. A dark pickup truck was parked outside, the same general make and model that had left tire tracks at the murder scene. Wardell's team surrounded the property, officers taking positions behind trees and vehicles, rifles trained on the exits. "Ronnie Towns," Wardell's voice boomed through a megaphone. "This is the Telfair County Sheriff's Office. We have a warrant for your arrest. Come out with your hands up." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the trailer door opened, and a man stepped out, tall, thin, wearing jeans and a t-shirt despite the cold. His hands were raised, but his face showed no surprise, no fear, only resignation. Ronnie Adrian Towns had been expecting this. Ronnie Towns sat in the interview room at the Telfair County Sheriff's Office, his wrists handcuffed to a metal ring bolted to the table. He hadn't asked for a lawyer, hadn't tried to deny anything. He simply stared at the gray concrete wall with the hollow expression of a man who knew his life was over. Detective Wardell entered carrying a thick folder of evidence and 2 cups of coffee. He set one in front of Ronnie, who didn't touch it. The digital recorder on the table blinked red, documenting every word. A video camera mounted in the corner captured every facial expression, every gesture. This interview would be played in court, dissected by prosecutors and defense attorneys, analyzed for any hint of coercion or violation of rights. You've been read your Miranda rights? Wardell began, sitting across from Ronnie. You understand you have the right to an attorney? That anything you say can be used against you in court? I understand. Ronnie's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Don't need a lawyer. I know what I did. Wardell opened the folder and spread crime scene photographs across the table. Bud Runyon's body in the ravine. June Runyon face down in the leaves. The abandoned envoy. The drag marks through the forest. Ronnie glanced at them briefly, then looked away. Tell me what happened, Wardell said. From the beginning. Ronnie was silent for nearly a minute, his jaw working as if chewing words he didn't want to speak. Finally, he began. I needed money. Been out of work for 6 months. My girlfriend's pregnant. Bills piling up. Probation officer threatening to violate me if I didn't pay my fees. I was desperate. So you created a fake Craigslist ad? Yeah. I'd seen other people do it. Advertise something valuable. Get people to meet you somewhere isolated, rob them. Figured if I picked the right item, I could get someone with serious cash. Ronnie's hands trembled slightly. I found pictures of a Mustang online, created the listing, waited to see who'd bite. Bud Runyon contacted you. He was perfect, old guy, clearly had money if he was looking at $30,000 cars. We emailed back and forth. I made up stories about my dead father, about needing to sell quick. Built trust. Ronnie's voice carried no pride in this deception, only a dull recitation of facts. I gave him that fake address on County Road 447. I knew that area. My uncle used to hunt out there. No houses, no people, no cell towers. Perfect place for what I was planning. Wardell leaned forward. What were you planning, Ronnie? Robbery or murder? Just robbery, I swear to God, I just wanted the money. For the first time, emotion cracked through Ronnie's facade. Desperation, a need to be believed. I wasn't going to hurt them. I had a gun, yeah, but just to scare them. Take the cash, let them go, they'd report it, but I'd be long gone. But that's not what happened. Ronnie's eyes closed. No, that's not what happened. Walk me through it. January 22nd. What time did you get to the location? Around 11:30. I parked my truck down the driveway, waited at the clearing. They showed up maybe 15 minutes later in that white SUV. Old couple, just like I expected. The man got out first. Bud. He was friendly, smiling, excited about seeing the car. Ronnie's voice dropped to barely a whisper. I told him there was no car. How did he react? Confused at first, then scared when he realized what was happening. I pulled out my gun, 9mm Glock I'd bought off a guy in Jacksonville, and told them to give me their money and valuables. The old man, Bud, he tried to reason with me. Said we could work something out, that they wouldn't call the police if I just let them leave. Wardell kept his voice neutral, professional. Even his rage simmered beneath the surface. Did they give you the money? Bud reached for his wallet, moving slow so I wouldn't spook. He handed it over. Had exactly 30,000 in hundreds, all stacked neat. I took it. Took the woman's purse too. June. Her name was June. Ronnie's hands were shaking violently now. That should have been it. I should have just taken the money and run, but what? June was on her phone. She'd been trying to get a signal the whole time, and suddenly she got one, just one bar, and she started dialing. I panicked. If she called 911, if she got through even for a few seconds, they'd have my description, the location, everything. Ronnie's breathing was becoming ragged. I yelled at her to drop the phone. She wouldn't. She kept trying to dial, kept saying, "Please, we have grandchildren, please just let us go." And you shot her. Ronnie nodded, tears streaming down his face now. I didn't mean to. My finger just squeezed. The gun went off. She fell. And then Bud, he screamed, started running at me, trying to fight me even though I had the gun. And I shot him too. 3, 4 times. I don't even remember. He fell down and I shot him again to make sure he was dead. The room was silent except for Ronnie's ragged breathing and quiet sobs. Wardell let the moment hang there. Let the weight of the confession settle. This was the moment that would define the case. The admission of premeditated robbery that had escalated into double murder. "What did you do after they were dead?" Wardell asked. "I freaked out. I'd never killed anyone before, never even fired a gun at a person. There was so much blood. June was still breathing, these horrible gurgling sounds, so I—" Ronnie couldn't finish the sentence. "You shot her again, in the back, while she was dying. I wanted it to be over. I didn't want her to suffer." The justification sounded pathetic even as Ronnie spoke it. "Then I searched their bodies, took everything valuable, watches, jewelry, their phones, dragged them into the woods and pushed them down that ravine, covered them with branches. I thought maybe no one would find them for a while, long enough for me to get out of the state. But you didn't leave." "No, I went back to my girlfriend's place, hid the money in the trailer, tried to act normal, but I couldn't stop thinking about them, about their faces, about June trying to call for help, about how Bud tried to protect her even though he knew he was going to die." Ronnie looked directly at Wardell for the first time. "I'm not a monster, detective. I'm just a fuck-up who made the worst decision of his life." Wardell wanted to argue that point, wanted to tell Ronnie that normal people don't murder elderly couples over money, that his actions were monstrous regardless of his intentions, but he kept his professional composure. "You still have some of their belongings?" "Yeah, most of it's in my truck. I tried to sell June's laptop to my aunt, but she got suspicious. The phones I threw in a river. The watches and jewelry are in a box under my bed." "Where's the gun?" "Same place, under the bed. I haven't touched it since that day." The search of Ronnie's trailer and truck yielded exactly what he'd described. The Runion's laptop with their smiling faces still on the wallpaper, June's diamond earrings and bracelet, Bud's watch, a Rolex he'd received for his 50th birthday. The 9mm Glock with 4 rounds fired, the serial number filed off. And hidden in a vent under the bathroom sink, $28,300 in cash. Ronnie had already spent $1,700 on bills and groceries. Ballistics testing confirmed the gun was the murder weapon. The bullets recovered from the Runion's bodies matched the Glock's rifling pattern perfectly. DNA evidence from blood on Ronnie's boots matched both victims. The Bluetooth signature logged by the Envoy's GPS system belonged to Ronnie's cell phone. Every piece of evidence corroborated his confession. But as the investigation deepened, Wardell discovered something that made the case even more disturbing. Ronnie Towns had attempted this scheme twice before. 3 months earlier, a couple from Valdosta had responded to a similar Craigslist ad for a vintage motorcycle. They'd driven to a remote location in rural Georgia, but had gotten spooked by the isolation and left before anyone appeared. 2 weeks after that, a man from Savannah had arranged to buy a boat advertised on Craigslist, but had insisted on meeting in a public parking lot instead of the seller's property. In both cases, the seller had never shown up, and the ads had disappeared. The Runions had simply been the first victims who'd followed through completely, who'd trusted enough, who'd been isolated enough, who'd been vulnerable enough to fall into Ronnie's trap. Jessica Runion was allowed to read Ronnie's confession 2 days after his arrest. Wardell met her at the sheriff's office and gave her a redacted version with the most graphic details removed. She read it in silence, tears streaming down her face, her hands shaking. "He's sorry?" she said when she finished, her voice sharp with anger. "He's sorry? My parents are dead because he needed money because his girlfriend was pregnant? People have problems every day and they don't murder innocent people." "I know," Wardell said quietly. "And June? My mother tried to call for help. She got a signal. She could have saved them if he'd just let her make that call." Jessica's voice broke. Someone could have answered. Someone could have sent help. Instead, he shot her for trying to survive. This was the question that haunted Wardell and that would haunt the Runion family forever. What if June's 911 call had connected? What if, in that brief moment when her phone showed 1 bar of service, she'd managed to get through to an emergency dispatcher? Would help have arrived in time? Would patrol cars have intercepted Ronnie as he fled the scene? The technical analysis was inconclusive, Cell tower records showed that June's phone had briefly connected to a tower in McRae at 12:17 p.m. on January 22nd. The connection had lasted 9 seconds before dropping. No call had completed. No data had been transmitted. It was impossible to know if she dialed 911 or if the signal had failed before the call could even initiate. But the fact remained. There had been a moment, a brief, fragile window, when rescue might have been possible. And in that moment, Ronnie Towns had made the choice to eliminate the threat rather than flee. He'd chosen to murder rather than risk capture. The district attorney, Thomas Bradford, charged Ronnie Adrian Towns with 2 counts of malice murder, 2 counts of felony murder, 2 counts of armed robbery, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. Georgia was a death penalty state, and Bradford made it clear he would be seeking the ultimate punishment. This was a calculated, premeditated scheme to lure innocent victims into a death trap, Bradford told reporters at a press conference. Ronnie Towns spent days building trust with Bud and June Runyon, creating an elaborate lie designed specifically to isolate them in a place where they had no help, no protection, no chance of escape. And when they complied with his demands, when they gave him everything he asked for, he executed them in cold blood. This is exactly the kind of crime that warrants the death penalty in Georgia. Ronnie's court-appointed attorney argued for a plea deal, life in prison without parole, in exchange for avoiding a trial. But Jessica Runyon and her family wanted their day in court. They wanted a jury to hear exactly what had happened to Bud and June. They wanted the world to know what had been taken from them. The trial was scheduled for August, giving both sides time to prepare. In the meantime, Ronnie Towns sat in a cell at the Telfair County Jail, held without bond, waiting to face justice for the 2 lives he'd destroyed in a clearing in the woods. While the investigation into Bud and June Runyon's murders moved toward trial, a separate story emerged that would cast an unsettling light on how missing persons cases were handled in rural Georgia. This story began not with a crime, but with a mystery that had lasted 44 years. A mystery that, as investigators would discover, should never have been a mystery at all. In April 1980, Charles and Catherine Romer checked into the Holiday Inn in Brunswick, Georgia. They were traveling from their home in upstate New York to Miami Beach for vacation, and Brunswick was meant to be just an overnight stop. Charles was 43, a successful businessman with graying temples and an easy smile. Catherine was 42, a schoolteacher who loved reading mystery novels and collected seashells. They checked in on the afternoon of April 8th, paid for one night, and told the front desk clerk they'd be leaving early the next morning to beat the Florida traffic. They were never seen again. Their room key was turned in the next morning, but no one saw them leave. Their car, a 1978 Lincoln Continental, was gone from the parking lot. For decades, their disappearance remained one of Georgia's most baffling missing persons cases. Had they been kidnapped? Murdered? Had they simply decided to abandon their lives and start over somewhere else? Their 3 children spent 44 years searching for answers, hiring private investigators, following false leads, watching their parents' case grow cold, and then colder as the years passed. The answer, it turned out, had been less than 200 feet from the Holiday Inn the entire time. In March 2024, a construction crew working on a drainage project at the site of the former Holiday Inn, now demolished and converted into a commercial parking lot, discovered something in the retention pond that bordered the property. A vehicle, completely submerged, covered in decades of algae and silt, barely visible beneath the murky water. When the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's dive team pulled the vehicle out, they found it was a 1978 Lincoln Continental. Inside were 2 sets of human remains, skeletal after more than 4 decades underwater, but still wearing the clothes they'd died in. Charles Romer's wallet was in his jacket pocket, his driver's license perfectly preserved in its plastic sleeve. Catherine Romer's purse was on the floorboard, her reading glasses still folded inside. The medical examiner's report concluded that the Romers had died shortly after checking into the hotel, likely on the evening of April 8th or early morning of April 9th, 1980. The cause of death was drowning. There were no signs of foul play, no evidence of violence. The most probable explanation was a tragic accident. Charles had been driving at night, perhaps disoriented in an unfamiliar area, and had accidentally driven into the retention pond. The car had sunk quickly in the deep water, and neither of them had been able to escape. But what made this discovery particularly disturbing was its proximity to the hotel. The retention pond was clearly visible from several rooms. It was adjacent to the parking lot. When the roamers were first reported missing in 1980, local police had conducted a search of the hotel grounds. They'd interviewed staff, reviewed the guest registry, even checked the parking lot for abandoned vehicles. But no one had thought to search the pond. Detective Maria Santos, who'd been assigned to review the roamer case after the discovery, pulled the original investigation files from 1980. What she found was a case study in negligence and assumptions. The initial missing persons report had been filed by the roamer's oldest daughter, Linda, when her parents failed to arrive in Miami as planned. Brunswick police had treated it as a low-priority case. Adults had the right to disappear if they wanted to, and there was no evidence of foul play. The investigating officer's notes from 1980 read, "Subjects checked out of hotel normally, vehicle not in parking lot, likely continued journey south or altered plans. No signs of distress or suspicious activity, but the roamers hadn't checked out normally. Someone had turned in their room key. Whether it was one of them or a housekeeping staff member who'd found the door unlocked was never determined. The assumption that they'd left willingly had prevented any thorough search of the immediate area. The pond was right there," Detective Santos told a reporter from the Brunswick News in April 2024, after the roamers' remains were identified. It would have taken one officer with a flashlight maybe 10 minutes to walk the perimeter and look into the water. If they'd done that in 1980, they might have seen tire tracks going down the embankment or noticed disturbed vegetation. The car could have been recovered within days instead of 44 years later. Linda Romer, now 67 years old, spoke publicly about the discovery at a press conference organized by the GBI. She stood beside her siblings, Michael, 65, and Patricia, 63. All of them gray-haired and exhausted from decades of searching for answers that had been, quite literally, right under everyone's noses the entire time. "My parents were good people," Linda said, her voice steady despite tears streaming down her face. "They didn't run away. They didn't abandon us. They died in a terrible accident, and they've been lying in that pond for 44 years because no one bothered to look. We've spent our entire adult lives wondering what happened to them, imagining the worst, hoping against hope that maybe they were alive somewhere. And all this time, they were less than 200 feet from where they were last seen." Michael Romer was less composed. "Someone should have found them in 1980, when the trail was fresh, when a search would have actually mattered. Instead, we got half-hearted police work and assumptions. Oh, they probably just changed their plans. Adults do that. No one considered that maybe something bad had happened. No one checked the obvious places." The discovery of the roamers sent shockwaves through Georgia's law enforcement community and sparked a broader conversation about how missing persons cases were handled, particularly in rural areas with limited resources. How many other families were waiting for answers that could be found with more thorough initial investigations? How many other missing persons were actually deceased, their bodies overlooked because searches had been inadequate? Detective Wardell, still working the Runyon case, found himself thinking about the roamers constantly. The circumstances were completely different. One was murder, the other an accident. But there was a common thread: the vulnerability of people in isolated areas, and the critical importance of thorough, immediate investigation. When Bud and June Runyon had gone missing, Jessica's initial call to the Telfair County Sheriff's Office had been met with skepticism. Adults aren't missing until 24 hours have passed. They probably just lost cell service. We can't search without a specific address. It was only Jessica's persistence and the discovery of the fake address that had prompted immediate action. But what if she hadn't pushed? What if she'd accepted the dispatcher's reassurances and waited until the next morning? By then, Ronnie Towns could have been halfway to another state. The envoy might have been stripped and abandoned somewhere else. The trail would have been colder, the evidence more contaminated. The Romer case highlighted a systemic problem: the assumption that missing adults had chosen to disappear rather than treating each case as potentially urgent. In rural areas like Telfair County, where resources were stretched thin and the landscape was vast, this assumption could be deadly. Sheriff James Odom held a department-wide meeting in May 2024 to address these concerns. Every deputy, every dispatcher, every administrative staff member was required to attend. Wardell stood at the front of the room alongside the sheriff, presenting case studies, including the Runions and the Roamers, to illustrate what could go wrong when missing persons reports weren't taken seriously. "I know we're a small department," Sheriff Odom said, addressing the 30 people gathered in the conference room. "I know we're dealing with budget constraints and staffing shortages, but we cannot let those limitations cause us to overlook potential emergencies. When someone calls to report a missing person, especially an elderly person, especially someone who was meeting a stranger in an isolated location, we need to treat that as urgent until we have evidence otherwise." New protocols were established. All missing persons reports, regardless of how long the person had been out of contact, would trigger an immediate preliminary investigation. This included checking last known locations, reviewing cell phone records if available, and conducting at least a basic search of the area where the person was last seen. If the Roamers had disappeared in 2024 instead of 1980, would we find them faster? Odom asked. "I'd like to think so, but we need to make sure our procedures are solid. We need to make sure that when families come to us desperate for help, we don't send them away with platitudes." The meeting concluded with a sobering presentation from the GBI about cold cases across Georgia that might be solvable with modern technology and renewed investigation. There were hundreds of them, people who'd vanished in the 70s, 80s, and 90s when forensic science was less advanced and communication was less instant. Some of those cases might be murders, some might be accidents like the Roamers, but all of them represented families still waiting for answers. Jessica Runion attended a victims advocacy meeting in Atlanta in June 2024, where she met Linda Roemer. The two women, both daughters who'd lost parents to Georgia tragedies, found common ground in their grief and their frustration with systems that had, in different ways, failed their families. "At least you got answers," Linda said to Jessica over coffee after the meeting. "You know what happened to your parents. You know who's responsible. My family spent 44 years in limbo, not knowing if our parents were alive or dead, if they'd been murdered or had abandoned us. That uncertainty is its own kind of torture." "But you had hope," Jessica replied. "For 44 years there was a chance they might still be out there. My parents were murdered within hours of disappearing. There was never any hope. Just immediate, final loss." Both women fell silent, recognizing that grief couldn't be compared or ranked. Loss was loss, tragedy was tragedy, whether it came quickly or dragged out over decades. "The worst part," Linda finally said, "is knowing it could have been prevented. If someone had just looked in that pond in 1980, really looked instead of assuming my parents had driven away, they would have found the car. My parents would have had proper burials. We would have had closure 44 years ago instead of spending our entire adult lives searching." Jessica nodded. "And if the sheriff's office had taken my call seriously immediately, instead of telling me to wait 24 hours, maybe they would have gotten to that location faster. Maybe they would have found my parents before." She couldn't finish the sentence. The Roemer discovery had prompted several other cold case reviews across Georgia. In Brunswick alone, 3 other missing persons cases from the 1970s and 1980s were being re-examined with modern investigative techniques. Ground-penetrating radar was being used to search undeveloped areas near where people had last been seen. Divers were checking bodies of water that had been overlooked in original investigations. In August 2024, one of these reviews yielded results. A man named Robert Klein, who disappeared in 1983 after leaving a bar in Waycross, was found in his own vehicle in a creek just a mile from that bar. Like the Roamers, he'd apparently driven off the road in the dark and drowned, his car hidden by vegetation and overlooked in the initial search. His family had spent 41 years believing he'd been murdered or had deliberately disappeared, when the truth was he'd died in a simple, tragic accident. These discoveries raised uncomfortable questions about how many other missing persons might be found, if searches were more thorough, if assumptions weren't made, if every case was treated as potentially urgent. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation announced in September 2024 that they were launching a comprehensive review of all unsolved missing persons cases dating back to 1970, using modern technology and investigative techniques to re-examine evidence and locations. But for families like the Runions and the Roemers, these improvements came too late. Their loved ones were already gone, victims not just of violence or accident, but of systems that hadn't responded quickly enough, thoroughly enough, or with enough urgency to prevent tragedy or provide timely answers. As Ronnie Towns' trial date approached, Detective Wardle found himself thinking about the broader implications of the case. The Runions had been murdered because they'd trusted a stranger, because they'd gone to an isolated location without adequate precautions, because they'd believed that nothing truly bad could happen to them in broad daylight in rural Georgia. But they'd also died because response systems had been inadequate. If Jessica's initial call had been treated as urgent, if deputies had been dispatched immediately to search County Road 447, would they have arrived in time? It was impossible to know. But the question haunted Wardle, just as the question of the unsearched pond haunted the officers who'd worked the Roemer case in 1980. These were the ghosts of negligence, not intentional wrongdoing, but the cumulative effect of assumptions, limited resources, and procedures that prioritized caution and skepticism over immediate action. In both cases, the cost had been measured in decades of grief and unanswered questions. The trial of Ronnie Adrian Towns began on August 12, 2024, in the Telfair County Superior Court. The small courtroom was packed with reporters, family members, and local residents who'd followed the case obsessively since the Runions' bodies had been discovered. Jessica Runion sat in the front row with her husband, Mark, and her 2 teenage children, determined to witness every moment of the proceedings. District Attorney Thomas Bradford presented a methodical, devastating case. He walked the jury through the timeline, the carefully crafted Craigslist ad, the week of trust-building emails, the fake address designed to lure victims into isolation. He showed them the crime scene photographs, the drag marks through the forest, the bodies in the ravine. He played portions of Ronnie's confession, his voice hollow and remorseless, as he described pulling the trigger. This wasn't a crime of passion, Bradford told the jury during his opening statement. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was a calculated execution. Ronnie Towns spent days planning how to lure innocent people into a trap. He chose the location carefully. No witnesses, no cell service, no chance of rescue. And when Bud and June Runion arrived, trusting and vulnerable, he robbed them and murdered them in cold blood. The defense attorney, a young public defender named Sarah Chen, faced an almost impossible task. Her client had confessed. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The best she could offer was mitigation, arguing that Ronnie hadn't planned to kill anyone, that the murders had been a panicked response rather than premeditated acts. My client made terrible choices, Chen told the jury. He planned a robbery and that was wrong, but he didn't wake up that morning intending to kill 2 people. The evidence will show that the situation escalated beyond his control, that he panicked when June Runion tried to call for help. This is a tragedy, but it's not the cold, calculated murder the prosecution wants you to believe. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous on all counts. Guilty of 2 counts of malice murder, 2 counts of felony murder, 2 counts of armed robbery, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. The sentencing phase began immediately. Under Georgia law, the jury would decide whether Ronnie Towns would receive life in prison or the death penalty. Bradford argued forcefully for death, citing the vulnerability of the victims, the premeditated nature of the crime, and the complete lack of remorse. Jessica Runion was allowed to give a victim impact statement. She stood at the podium, her hands gripping the edges to keep them from shaking, and looked directly at Ronnie Towns. "You took my parents from me," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "You took my children's grandparents. You took 2 people who'd never hurt anyone. who were excited about buying a classic car, who trusted you because they believed people were fundamentally good. You betrayed that trust in the cruelest way possible. She paused, collecting herself. My mother tried to call for help. In her last moments, she was trying to save herself and my father. And you shot her for it. You shot her in the back while she was trying to survive. That's the kind of person you are. Someone who murders an elderly woman for trying to live. Ronnie sat motionless, staring at the table in front of him. He didn't look at Jessica, didn't acknowledge her words. His face remained blank, empty, as if he'd already accepted whatever fate awaited him. The jury deliberated on sentencing for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman read the verdict. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Not the death penalty, but a sentence that ensured Ronnie Towns would never walk free again. Jessica felt a complex mix of emotions as the sentence was read. Part of her had wanted death, wanted Ronnie to face the ultimate punishment for what he'd done, but another part was relieved. Death penalty cases dragged on for decades with appeals and legal challenges. This way, it was finished. Ronnie would spend the rest of his life in a cell, and her family could begin to move forward. Outside the courthouse, Bradford addressed the media. While we'd hoped for the death penalty, we respect the jury's decision. Ronnie Towns will die in prison. He'll never hurt another family. Justice has been served for Bud and June Runyon. Detective Wardell stood beside Jessica as reporters shouted questions. "How do you feel about the verdict?" one asked. Jessica took a breath. "I feel like my parents' deaths meant something. Like maybe this case will make people more cautious about meeting strangers from online ads. And maybe it'll make law enforcement take missing persons reports more seriously, especially when elderly people are involved." In the months following the trial, the Runyon case did indeed have broader impacts. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation launched a task force specifically targeting online classified scams that lured victims into isolated locations. They coordinated with Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, and other platforms to identify suspicious patterns, high-value items listed at below-market prices, sellers insisting on remote meeting locations, prepaid phone numbers that couldn't be traced. Between August 2024 and March 2025, the task force identified and prevented 12 attempted robbery schemes similar to Ronnie Towns' operation. 3 suspects were arrested before they could harm anyone. Countless potential victims were warned away from dangerous situations. The Telfair County Sheriff's Office implemented its new missing persons protocols, and other rural Georgia counties followed suit. Response times improved. Searches became more thorough. The assumption that missing adults had simply wandered off was replaced with immediate investigation and evidence gathering. But for the Runyon family, no policy changes or task forces could bring back what they'd lost. Jessica cleared out her parents' house in Marietta over the course of 3 painful weekends, boxing up 50 years of memories, photo albums, her father's tools, her mother's collection of ceramic birds, the Christmas decorations they'd never use again. In the garage, she found the research her father had done on 1966 Mustangs, printouts of specifications, forum discussions about restoration techniques, a notebook where he'd calculated exactly how much the car would cost to insure and maintain. He'd been so excited, so full of plans for the future, and all of it had been destroyed by one man's greed and desperation. The parallels with the Romer case continued to haunt investigators. In May 2025, the Brunswick Police Department held a memorial service for Charles and Catherine Romer, 45 years after their deaths. Their children, now all in their late 60s, finally laid their parents to rest in a cemetery in upstate New York, bringing closure to a mystery that should never have lasted more than a few days. "The systems failed them," Linda Romer said at the memorial, not just in 1980 but for 44 years afterward. "No one looked hard enough. No one questioned the assumptions. And my parents lay in that pond invisible, while we spent our lives searching for them in all the wrong places." Detective Santos, who'd worked the reopened Romer case, announced that Brunswick PD would be conducting comprehensive searches of all bodies of water within a mile radius of locations where people had gone missing in the past 50 years. "We owe it to families to be thorough," she said, "to question our assumptions, to look in the obvious places before we conclude that someone simply vanished." Jessica Runyon and Linda Romer remained in contact, their shared experiences creating a bond that transcended their different circumstances. They both became advocates for missing persons' families, speaking at law enforcement conferences and community meetings about the importance of immediate, thorough investigations. "Every missing person deserves to be searched for as if they're in immediate danger," Jessica would tell audiences. "Because sometimes they are. My parents had maybe 15 minutes between arriving at that location and being murdered. 15 minutes when they might have been saved if someone had taken my concerns seriously and dispatched officers immediately." Ronnie Towns served his sentence at Georgia State Prison in Reidsville. He gave one interview from prison, published in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution in December 2024, where he expressed remorse for his actions. "I think about them every day," he said, "about Bud and June, about how scared they must have been, about June trying to call for help and me doing what I did. I can't take it back. I'll spend the rest of my life wishing I could." The interview sparked controversy. Some readers felt he deserved no platform to express his feelings. Others saw it as a cautionary tale about how desperation and poor choices could destroy multiple lives. Jessica refused to read it. "I don't care about his remorse," she said. "It doesn't bring my parents back." By early 2025, the Runyon case had become part of Georgia's collective memory, a reminder of the dangers lurking in seemingly innocent online transactions, of the importance of meeting strangers in public places, of the need for vigilance even in broad daylight. The case was taught in criminal justice classes, featured in true crime documentaries, discussed in online safety seminars. But for Jessica and her family, it would always be personal. Not a case study or a cautionary tale, but the story of how they lost the two people they loved most in the world. On what would have been Bud Runyon's 73rd birthday, Jessica visited the cemetery where her parents were buried side by side. She brought flowers, yellow roses, her mother's favorite, and sat on the grass between their headstones. "Dad," she said quietly, "I hope wherever you are, you finally got that Mustang. I hope you and Mom are driving it somewhere beautiful, with the top down and the sun shining. I hope you're at peace." The wind rustled through the trees overhead, carrying the scent of pine and earth. In the distance, she could hear traffic on the highway, the sounds of life continuing despite loss. She stayed there for an hour, talking to her parents about her children, about the seasons changing, about how much she missed them. When she finally stood to leave, she placed her hand on each headstone. The granite was cold and smooth beneath her palm, permanent, unchanging, a marker of lives that had been cut short by violence but would never be forgotten. Justice had been served. Ronnie Towns would never hurt anyone again. But for Jessica Runyon, no verdict could truly balance the scales or fill the void left by her parents' absence. She would carry that loss for the rest of her life, a weight that never lightened but that she learned gradually to bear. The sun was setting as she drove home, painting the Georgia sky in shades of orange and gold. The kind of sunset her father would have stopped to photograph, the kind of beauty her parents had been seeking on their drive south that January day. Life went on, inexorably forward, even as the past remained forever present in memory and grief.